So this might just be one of the most horrific cases that I have covered in some time. And from my understanding, this case is the case in Melbourne, the case that continues to haunt Melburnians. The reason why women in Melbourne and everywhere check their back seats before climbing into their cars. And the reason that I have decided to cover this case now is because the perpetrator is up for parole next year, 2023. And I will have petitions linked down below in regards to that, but more on that point later. So between February and July of 1993, a series of incredibly disturbing crimes occurred in and around the Frankston area of Melbourne. The first of these crimes happened on a rainy February evening on Claude Street in Seaford. Donna Vane was helping out her boyfriend at his pizza delivery job with her 1-month-old baby in tow. Now, you may be wondering why on earth would she want to be taking along her 1-month-old baby on a pizza delivery run when she could just be home? Well, recently Donna had been receiving some very unsettling prank phone calls, and she felt just too unsafe to stay home alone, so she asked her boyfriend if she could just join him for the evening, and he agreed. Upon arriving home after the pizza run, Donna discovered that her flat had been broken into, but this was no ordinary break-in. Inside, she found that her cats and kittens had been maliciously killed. Her walls and furniture had been slashed, and her baby's bassinet had naked pictures of women that had been ripped out of magazines in it, and these pictures had stab marks through them that went through to the bassinet. So somebody had gone through her home with a knife or something similar and just slashed walls, furniture, and stabbed her bassinet, or her baby's bassinet, and left these pictures in there. It was a very disturbing scene, and nothing was taken. So if that isn't all terrifying enough, the most terrifying detail was a message that was left for Donna by the perpetrator, written on her wall in the blood of her deceased cats. It said, "Donna, you're dead." She of course phoned the police and soon gave them a list of potential suspects, including several ex-boyfriends and one creepy neighbour. However, after several months, there was no arrests. Although police did interview a couple of the ex-boyfriends, nothing really came of this. Investigators would later learn that Donna had actually given them the name of the person responsible, but they just didn't get around to interviewing this particular person because they weren't really a very good suspect. And unsurprisingly, Donna decided to move out of her flat and in with her sister, who lived really close by, who also happened to live right next door to the person that broke into Donna's home. Of course, she didn't know this at the time, and it would be months and months before Donna learned just how close she had come to becoming the first victim of the Frankston serial killer. Several months after the break-in at Donna's flat, on the evening of Friday, June 11, 18-year-old Elizabeth Anne-Marie Stevens was catching a bus home from the TAFE library. She had only recently moved to Melbourne from Hobart in Tasmania, that little triangle at the bottom of Australia, and was staying with her aunt and uncle on Patterson Avenue in Langwarrin as she completed her VCE at the Frankston TAFE. And in Melbourne, a VCE is a high school certificate, and TAFE in Australia is similar to community college in the US. So Elizabeth had experienced a pretty tough upbringing in Tassie, so this move to Melbourne really was her chance for a fresh start. And after completing her studies, her dream was to join the army. As she often did, Elizabeth left her aunt and uncle a note that day telling them where she would be and what time to expect her home. Around 8 p.m, Elizabeth got off the bus at the corner of Long Street and Cranbourne Frankston Road and began her short 6-minute walk home in the pouring rain. And just as she turned down the street where she lived, out of nowhere, a man grabbed Elizabeth, putting one hand over her mouth and the other holding a gun to the back of her head. He told her, "Shut up or I'll blow your head off." They continued to walk down Patterson Avenue in the direction of Elizabeth's home, and he even forced her to hold his hand, all the while shoving a gun in her back. And unbeknownst to Elizabeth, this gun was a complete fake. Passers-by even saw Elizabeth and the man walking that night, but assumed they were a couple because they were holding hands, so they didn't give the pair a second thought. So she never did get as far as her home because the man turned right on Malcolm Road, headed for Lloyd Park Reserve. They entered the park and he dragged her towards an area with bushland, where he proceeded to brutally end her life. Just 1 hour after the murder, the perpetrator was sitting down to eat a soup and roast dinner at his girlfriend's mum's warm, dry home, as if nothing had ever happened, as the rain washed away any evidence that had been created. Elizabeth should have arrived home just after 8 p.m. So when 10 p.m. rolled around and she still was not home, her aunt and uncle became incredibly concerned. Her uncle decided to drive around and look for her while her aunt stayed home just in case she called or returned. But by 1 a.m, with no Elizabeth in sight, they phoned the police. The bad weather meant a search did not start until the next morning. However, it wasn't long before a member of the public reported finding a body partially covered by branches at the Lloyd Park Reserve, and this body was soon identified as Elizabeth Stevens. Elizabeth had been repeatedly stabbed, her throat stomped on, and she had slashes on her body in these strange crisscross patterns. Unfortunately though, much of the evidence had been washed away by the rain, and no witnesses ever came forward, leaving investigators at a loss. Even the bus driver that night couldn't manage to remember if Elizabeth had been on his bus that night. And those that saw her with this man holding hands never put 2 and 2 together at the time. The case did make front page news in Melbourne, but at this stage, the idea that a serial killer may be on the loose was yet to enter people's minds. So just 1 month after the murder of Elizabeth Stevens, on Thursday, July 8, another woman was attacked after getting off public transport. Just before 6 p.m, 41-year-old Rosa Toff hopped off her train at the Seaford train station and began walking home north on Railway Parade. As she passed the Seaford North Reserve, a man grabbed her and held a gun, again, it was a fake gun, to her head, demanding that she shut up and do as he said. All very similar to Elizabeth's attack. Rosa complied, or so the man thought, as he began dragging her towards the park. The man must have slightly relaxed after Rosa complied, because this is when she broke free of his grip and ran towards the street, screaming at passers-by for help. And a very generous woman soon stopped to help Rosa, who did have a few minor injuries, and gave her a lift to safety. She of course phoned the police to report this disturbing incident, describing the man as about 180 centimetres tall, with a round face, blue eyes, aged between 18 and 20 years old. Like Donna Vale, Rosa had no idea at the time just how close she had come to becoming the Frankston serial killer's second victim. Unfortunately, Rosa's escape had only angered her attacker, and he continued to hunt elsewhere. That same evening, 22-year-old Debra Freem was home with her 12-day-old son and a friend, Russell Hayes. Debra, who lived on Cananock Avenue in Seaford, was planning to make a dinner of veggies and an omelette for herself and Russell when she realised that she was going to need some more milk. She asked Russell if he could just stay home and watch the baby for a couple of minutes while she popped out for a few supplies at her local deli. Or if you live in Melbourne, apparently you guys call a deli a milk bar. I literally had to Google what a milk bar was during my research because all I could picture in my head was some old-fashioned 1950s milkshake style bar. But regardless of what you call it, deli, milk bar, corner store, general store, this is where Debra was heading. Let me know down below what you call it. I've literally never heard the term milk bar. That's interesting to me. Anyway, at around 7:20 p.m, Debra hopped in her grey Nissan Pulsar and drove the 1 minute down the road to the Cananock Milk Bar. There she grabbed half a dozen eggs, some milk and a chocolate bar. And whether it was intentional or on purpose, when she ran inside, Debra didn't lock her car doors, perhaps figuring that she would only be a minute or so. However, she was in the store long enough for somebody to notice her pull up alone, check if her car doors were unlocked, and proceed to hop in the back seat, crouch down, and wait for her return. Debra soon emerged from the deli, hopped back in her car, and began making a U-turn home when she felt a gun being shoved in the back of her head and a man telling her to drive. In her shock, she crashed the car into the office next door before the man ordered her to keep driving. Witnesses would later recall seeing a grey Nissan Pulsar that night driving erratically, veering onto the wrong side of the road with its headlights flashing and high beams on. And of course, this would have been Debra trying to get somebody's attention, but to no avail. As Debra continued to drive erratically, the man in the back seat, probably panicking, lurched forward and grabbed the steering wheel, attempting to straighten the car, before finally becoming fed up and making her pull over on Taylor's Road in Carrum Downs, which was about a 13-odd minute drive away from where they had been. There, he ordered her out of her vehicle, where he proceeded to strangle Debra to death, stab and slash her body repeatedly, before dumping her in the shrubbery and using her car to get away. 1 hour later, when Debra had not returned home, Russell became incredibly worried and phoned her boyfriend, who was working a night shift, as well as local hospitals in case she had been involved in some sort of accident. Russell and Debra's boyfriend also decided to do a drive around to see if they could locate her, but after no luck, they reported her missing to the police. And a search soon began, with some speculating that maybe postpartum depression had caused her to run away, despite her family saying how happy she had been after giving birth to her son. But this theory was soon put to rest when Debra's car was located the next day. About 5 minutes from where she lived on Madden Street was Debra's grey Nissan Pulsar, but neither Debra nor her belongings were inside. Investigators did find some of her blood in the vehicle, but the most telling detail of all was that her driver's seat was in the fully pushed back position. And this was important because Debra was a rather petite woman, so she never drove with her seat all the way back, meaning that it was someone else that had last driven her car and not Debra. 4 days after her disappearance on Monday, July 12, a local farmer found a woman partially covered in branches in shrubbery on Taylor's Road in Carrum Downs, and this was Debra Freem. Unfortunately, just like with the Elizabeth Stevens case, It had been raining the night the crime took place, so much of the evidence had been washed away. And it would turn out that this rainy weather was a part of the killer's pattern, choosing to hunt and kill on days when it rained to attempt to destroy the evidence. After Debra's murder, the police were certain that they had a serial killer on their hands. And the idea that Frankston had a killer on the loose sent fear through the entire community. The police warned the public, particularly females, to avoid travelling alone if they could, avoid going out where possible, and of course remain extra cautious and extra vigilant. They did also up police presence in Frankston, hoping to deter the killer, and they also did at around this time develop a suspect profile. So they announced that they believed this killer was between the age of 18 and 24, likely a local, and possibly lived alone. He may also have a low-skilled job or no job at all. Despite the police and the community's best efforts, the Frankston serial killer would strike one last time, right under the noses of the police. On the afternoon of Friday, July 30, at around 3 p.m, 17-year-old Natalie Jane Russell was walking home from school, John Paul College in Frankston. And it was another rainy, dreary day in Melbourne, the type of weather the police investigation had come to dread. So Natalie was a popular student in her final year of school, with plans to attend university after graduation and possibly study something in the media. The walk she planned to take home that day was one that she had taken many times before. It took her down McMahon's Road, right onto Sky Road, and through a shortcut located between two golf courses. And this shortcut was basically a pathway surrounded by a wired fence and some shrubbery. That day, as Natalie entered the shortcut, she passed a hole in the wired fence, and unbeknownst to her, a man was actually behind it, watching her from behind a tree. A little further up, Natalie passed another hole in the fence, and as she did, this man jumped out, putting one hand over her mouth and the other holding a knife, as he dragged her back through the hole into his lair and away from the public view, where in the shrubbery he killed her and left her there. She had been just 250 metres or 820 feet from her home, and the entire incident happened incredibly quickly. When Natalie did not return home at her usual time, her parents grew concerned, particularly as Natalie was a girl that always told her parents where she would be, where she was going, what time she would be home, and if she was going to be late. Her parents, of course, grew incredibly concerned, and by 8 p.m, they had reported her disappearance to the police. It did not take long for the police to find Natalie's body, having been left in the shrubbery where she was killed. And police could hardly believe that in broad daylight, under heavy police presence, the Frankston serial killer had struck again in what appeared to be an even more calculated and brazen attack. These holes in the fence that I mentioned, there was 3 in total, suggested that the attacker had, unlike the other murders, pre-planned this attack and was hiding out, ready to pounce on his next victim. Luckily, this case was about to be blown wide open by a member of the public, no less. Upon examining Natalie's body, it appeared that she had put up one hell of a fight, during which her attacker had left behind some of his DNA, including hair and skin. And this had not washed away, despite it being a rainy day. So this was another little win for the investigation at the time. And a little side note, the shortcut that Natalie took has since been renamed Nat's Track, with a plaque placed there in her memory. So unlike the other murders, this one had a witness. Vicky Collins was a postal worker just finishing up her mail run on Sky Road when she noticed a rusty, beaten up yellow Toyota Corona missing its number plates parked in the street. But what really caught Vicky's attention was the overweight man sitting in the driver's seat, slinked down low, as if he was scoping out the area. And maybe if the Frankston murders had not been making headlines at the time, Vicky wouldn't have given this incident a second thought. But because the community was on high alert, she decided that she was going to report the incident to the police, straight away in fact. She approached a stranger's house and asked to use their phone to contact the police, keeping in mind, of course, that mobile phones were not a thing back then. And I must say, good on Vicky. The amount of people that would have brushed off this incident as paranoia and kept on with their day, tried to keep out of it, is probably pretty high. She went out of her way to report it, and she deserves credit for that. Quite frankly, it's likely that her actions saved another girl's life. And as we would later find out, the day after Natalie's murder, the Frankston killer was back on the hunt. As Vicky was making this call to the police, she saw Natalie Russell walking down Sky Road towards the track. Then, moments later, the man in the yellow vehicle jumped out and ran down the track ahead of Natalie. What Vicky could not see, though, was the man climbing through the hole in the fence that he himself had cut earlier that day with a pair of pliers, and crouch down and wait for this schoolgirl that he had spotted to pass by. And it was just 15 minutes after Vicky called the police that they arrived. As I said, this murder did take place very quickly. So of course at this point the man was not in his car, so the police took down his registration details and began house knocking before they were called away to another incident. Meanwhile, the perpetrator had actually spotted the police, shoved his bloodied hands in his pockets, and walked right by them, and passed his car just moments after committing this murder. As I said, incredibly brazen. Later on, the killer also came back to collect his car, which in itself was a bold act, considering the police could have been waiting out for him. And soon after, the police looked up the registration details of the beaten up Toyota Corona, and this led them to a local man, 21-year-old Paul Charles Dania. On the afternoon of Saturday, July 31, one day after the murder of Natalie Russell, Paul Dania had parked his car at a local shopping centre with his car bonnet open, checking his engine as he scoped out the car park. And the engine, you may have guessed, was in perfect working order. Next to his car, right next to it in fact, a woman was alone in her vehicle taking a nap. Just as he was putting his plan into action to make her his next victim, her friends returned from the shops, got in the car, and they all drove away. And unbeknownst to the friends, and maybe they still don't know, they saved their friend's life that was napping in the car. Later that day, Paul Dania received a knock on his front door. It was the police. And at the time, he lived in a unit at 186 Frankston Dandenong Road in Seaford with his girlfriend, and he was unemployed. Also living next to Paul was Donna Vane, the woman we discussed at the beginning who had experienced the terrifying break-in. This connection wasn't made at the time, but the creepy neighbour Donna mentioned to the police as a potential suspect had in fact been Paul Dania. So the police were just there for like a casual chat to ask him what he had been doing in his car the previous day near where a murder had taken place. And the investigators also noticed some cuts on Paul's hands, some old and some new. And this, combined with his strange behaviour, was enough for the police to ask Paul to accompany them down to the police station for further questioning. He agreed, and over the course of many many hours, the police asked Paul more than 1,500 questions, including where he got these cuts on his hands. And they also asked him where he had been on the days of each of the recent Frankston murders. He told the police he had cut his hands trying to cut a cake, and he also recalled with a freakish precision and detail where he had been when each of the murders took place. Now, I don't know about you, but I barely even remember what I did yesterday, let alone a random day a few weeks or months ago. Paul's almost rehearsed answers only made police even more suspicious, so they asked him for a DNA sample, to which he agreed. Police also did notice that even though he'd been with the police for hours and hours, he didn't seem bored, agitated, or even tired. In fact, he seemed to be loving the attention. One detective later described Paul's interview as the most enthusiastic person to interview that I've ever been involved with. So investigators decided it was finally time to take a break from questioning, and this is where things took a very strange and unexpected turn. Detective Darren O'Loughlin was sitting with Paul during the break, cameras and recording devices off, when Paul stated, referring to Detective O'Loughlin, "That man gets in my head." He then also noticed a crucifix around the detective's neck, and Paul, who was a Christian himself, asked Detective O'Loughlin if he was as well. He told Paul that he was. That's when Paul said to him, "I did it." "Did what?" Detective O'Loughlin asked. Dania stated, "I committed the murders. I committed all of them." They had finally got a confession, and it hadn't even been recorded. So they hurried Dania back to the interview room and continued to record a detailed confession where he gave police details about the crimes that only the Frankston serial killer would know. He also admitted to the attempted abduction of Rosa Toff and Donna Vane's break-in, telling police he went there to kill Donna because he didn't like her sister, but she wasn't home, so he killed her cats instead. Investigators then asked Dania, "Why did you do it?" The crimes had not appeared to be sexually motivated, so they wanted to know what drove him to kill. He told police that he had had the urge to kill since he was just 14 years old and had been stalking women in the Frankston area since he was about 17, although he had never been on police's radar up until 24 hours previous. He also added that he just hated him. When asked to clarify whom he hated, he responded, "Women." Soon, Dania was running police through a reenactment of the murders where he told them he'd actually used a fake homemade gun with a wooden handle and just piping to scare the women into complying. So before moving on, I want to briefly discuss a little about who Paul Dania is. He was one of 7 children and somewhat considered the strangest of his siblings, or the black sheep. He was brought up as a Christian and continued to attend church as an adult. That was up until his pastor told him that he thought Dania was a wolf in sheep's clothing and was shunned from the church, which kind of feels like a strange thing for a pastor to say to someone. But anyway, during his childhood, he hurt and killed animals, a classic red flag of a serial killer, apparently. He then left school at age 15 and struggled to hold down a job for most of his adult life, being fired from several for being lazy. He even applied for the police force about a year before he started committing the murders, but was rejected due to his weight, which was roughly 120 kilos or 264 pounds. And actually, another common trait amongst serial killers is working or wanting to work in law enforcement. Not because they want to catch the bad guys, but because they enjoy control. So Paul Dania was charged with 3 counts of murder, and on December 20 of that same year, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. And Judge Frank Vincent said to Dania at the time, "For many, you are the fear that quickens their steps as they walk alone, or that causes a parent to look anxiously at a clock when a child is late." End quote. Now I know what you're thinking. Did the Australian justice system actually hand down a sentence fit for the crime? A life, meaning life, sentence? Well, Judge Vincent did try, but the following year, after Dania appealed, his sentence was reduced to a pathetic 30-year minimum, meaning he is due for parole next year, which is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And what a pathetic sentence. 10 years a life. And the reason given for lowering this sentence was because of his young age, 21, the fact that he pled guilty, and because they wanted to give him hope. What an absolute joke. Next year, Paul Dania will be just 51 years old. Young enough to begin a new life and to live a long and full one, something his victims will never get to do. I mentioned at the start of this video that I'll have petitions linked down below to keep this monster behind bars. Please consider signing. One petition is for Victorians only and one is for everyone else. Of course, if you're from Victoria, you can sign the other one as well. So since being in prison, Paul Dania has literally made no attempt to fly under the radar or keep his head down, making headlines pretty consistently over the last 30 years. Let's start by discussing what the media dubbed the Paul Dania letters, a series of letters Dania wrote to an inmate in prison between 03 and 04 to an individual he addressed as a Lady Jane. These letters are all published online, and in fact I will link them down below, and I will admit they were very interesting to read, to say the least. But these letters were significant because it is where we learn that Dania has, or at least he believes that he has, gender dysmorphia, which is when an individual believes that they were born in the wrong body or the wrong gender. Although correct me if I'm wrong, but that is how I understand it. So Dania, who signed off each letter as Paula, also admits in the letters that, quote, "I committed these disgusting crimes not because I ever hated womankind, but because I never really felt that I was a male," end quote. And besides a few interesting admissions and tidbits, the vibe of these letters is almost gossipy, and it comes across as though they've been written by a teenage girl. He often addresses Lady Jane as "Hey girl" or "Hi there girlfriend," and signs off with lines like "Blessed be" and "Your friend always Paula." Some of these letters even have little cutouts from girls' magazines, and several letters discuss the television show he was watching in prison, There's Something About Miriam. And in general, there's just a lot of gossipy little bits in there. Really check them out. The letters are both disturbing and fascinating. But moving on from the letters, along with requesting people call him Paula, although it was never legally changed, Dania also began wearing makeup that had been smuggled in for him, nail polish he made himself with glue, and women's clothing that he had sewed himself. This was despite the fact that all of this went against the prison rules, and makeup is considered contraband. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I doubt that the women's prisons are even allowed this much freedom in their personal appearance. Things like makeup and nail polish are a privilege, not a right, no matter how you identify, in my opinion. Dania did also request gender-affirming surgery, which would have been tax-funded, but after being medically assessed, he was denied. And a debate really went on for years at the time as to whether Paul Dania was serious about the request and his claims of gender dysmorphia, and opinions were really mixed, to say the least. Some believed he was just after attention and the whole ordeal was a stunt, but others believed he wouldn't risk transitioning genders in a prison environment if he wasn't serious, given how dangerous that would be for him. And transgender activist and educator Sally Goldner also spoke up about the matter, stating, quote, "It can have the potential, given the prejudice against transgender people, to perhaps make transgender people appear that they have psychological deficiencies or, heaven forbid, worse, that we're killers," end quote. And then there was Professor Ari Freiberg, I believe it's pronounced, a legal academic specialising in criminology and law, that said he believed, quote, "Prisoners shouldn't lose their legal rights simply because they are imprisoned," end quote. But let me know your thoughts down below. I am going to be very interested to hear everybody's thoughts on this. And if you are wondering why I have continued to call Paul Dania he, him throughout this video, it is because he has since reverted back to identifying as a male, making me personally think that he was never serious about wanting to transition in the first place. Anyway, I think I'll wrap it up here. Oh, let me know what you think of this new sort of set, by the way. I'm experimenting. This is literally taking up my whole little 1x1 apartment. Got a new lens as well, so let me know your thoughts. But thank you for being here and listening to the stories of Donna, Elizabeth, Rosa, Debra, and Natalie. And until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.